Hello, everybody. We're going to give folks a chance to join us in the virtual room, so hang tight for a couple minutes before we start up. All right, I know people are still arriving, but we've got a big crowd for this one and a lot to cover, so I'm going to get right into it. Hello, welcome to the Strada webcast from Public Viewpoint, examining the value of non-degree credentials. As you may know, this is an absolutely huge space, including certificates, apprenticeships, digital badges, occupational licenses, certifications, and lots more. Also one that a lot of folks are taking a closer look at amid the pandemic and the recovery. There's interest from the federal government in subsidizing more of these programs, states as well. And I think one thing that everybody can agree on is we just don't really know enough about these credentials and how they fare for learners. And that's what this data seeks to advance. But as well as a presentation from Andrew Hanson, who's Director of Research at Strada Education Network's Consumer Insights team, we'll have a panel featuring Holly Zanville, Research Professor and Co-Director of Program on Skills, Credentials, and Workforce Policy at George Washington University. See Holly there, hello. And Stella A. Perez, former CEO of Santa Cruz County Provisional Community College District. I'm Paul Fain, your moderator, journalist focused on connections between education and work, and frankly, almost exclusively on non-degree credentials. So I'm looking forward to learning here as well. So just a couple quick ground rules. Andrew's going to run through the findings and with some slides here for the first 15, 20 minutes or so. Then we're going to have a moderated Q&A with Holly and Stella. Please ask questions throughout in the Q&A function below. I see a lot of folks saying hello in the chat function, but if you can try to steer your questions to the Q&A, it's easier for us to answer them. And I'll steer them to our experts as quickly as I can, and we'll leave some time at the end just for your questions. So I hope you all stick with us throughout. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew.
Thanks, Paul. Got so many smart people on this topic in this conversation. It's really exciting. But just welcome to everybody on behalf of Strada. Thank you all for joining us today. We know that see here, non-degree education and training options have been growing for decades. We have 6 times as many workers who have a license or certification today compared to the 1950s. It was 5% then, now it's around 30%. We also have seen just tremendous growth in sub-baccalaureate certificates issued by colleges and universities each year. That's nearly doubled since the 1990s. And that's probably an underestimate because so much of the growth in these options is taking place in the non-credit space and other things that aren't really adequately captured by our data systems. And then what you see here last year is part of our public viewpoint work. We saw that when we asked people if you were to enroll in some kind of post-secondary education or training program in the next 6 months, what would you prefer? And we saw that the majority of people preferred a non-degree or skills training option. But Paul kind of alluded to, while the interest is high and growing, there continue to be questions about the quality and the value of these options, non-degree options. And so what we've done is gathered some more data, some more evidence to add to the tremendous work that's taken place, mostly I'd say on the labor market outcomes of non-degree programs. It's kind of come online over the past decade from many of our colleagues in the field, a lot of whom are members of the Non-Degree Credentials Research Network that Holly and her team at George Washington University lead. So really excited to have her here to share her expertise. Just a little housekeeping before we get into the results. What I'm going to share with you today are the results of our 2020 Strada Gallup Education Survey, which is a nationally representative survey of nearly 14,000 adults. And in that survey, we asked people with non-degree credentials many questions about their experience, including the type of non-degree credential they have, who issued it, how long their program was, and then most importantly, their perspective on the quality and the value of their credential or program. There are, go back here. So there's two kinds of non-degree credentials that we analyzed here. The first, which you see on the left here, is educational certificates. So these are similar to degree programs in that they're issued after you complete a sequence of courses. It's often at a community vocational or technical college. The difference is that they're usually shorter and they tend to feature little, if any, general coursework. And then the second that you see on the right here was professional licenses and certifications. And these are credentials that demonstrate that a worker is qualified to work in a specific job or occupation. They're legally required in the case of licenses, and they often require passing some kind of exam, although the criteria tend to vary, from license to license and state to state, which they govern these kinds of regulations. A couple of other notes on our methods that I want to share with you before we dive in. For the most part, we've combined, aggregated both of these types of non-degree credentials into a single category to kind of provide a high-level overview of this entire space. There's one exception where we're looking at educational certificates in isolation that I'll flag when we get to it. And then the bases that we use for each of the calculations are in the footers on each slide for those of you who are interested. Second, we're primarily reporting outcomes for individuals who say that a non-degree credential is their highest level of education, but there are a couple of places where we're looking at multiple credentials, people with college degrees as well as non-degree credentials. And then just a note on taxonomy, terminology, the non-degree topic is one where it seems like new terms are being introduced every month or every week. So, micro credentials, digital badges, nano credentials are a few that I've come across. With this particular type of analysis, there are measurement challenges with, associated with isolating those, either because they're, quite nascent, they are underdefined, or there's not really a consensus definition. But the major challenge is really just that the survey respondents aren't familiar with them, so you can't get valid data. So, and then the last thing I'll say is just that these are highlights, but there's a lot more interesting detail in the report that we released today as well. I'll allude to some of that detail in my remarks, and we'll link to that report in the chat as well for those of you who are interested. So, but with that housekeeping out of the way, let's dig into the analysis. So the first thing we did was we took a high-level view, as I said, of the whole non-degree credential market in terms of their prevalence and who's issuing these credentials. So what we found was basically that the market for these credentials is indeed quite massive. So we had 2 out of 5 adults overall say that they've earned a non-degree credential at some point. So either one of those, educational certificate or professional license or certification. 1 in 5 said it was their highest level of education. So if you think about, for example, the relative prevalence of degrees and non-degree education and training, we've got 46% of adults who have a degree, 40% who say they have a non-degree credential. But of course, so non-degree credentials are nearly as common, but we're really only beginning to understand how they're kind of situated in our education and training systems. It's also, not here, but in the report, it's incredibly common for adults to combine non-degree credentials with college degrees. About half of adults who had a college degree said they also had some kind of non-degree credential, and vice versa as well. some of you may be familiar with this big bucket, the some college, no degree category. A majority of adults in that category said they had a non-degree credential. And in addition to that, it's really common for folks who have non-degree credentials to have both types. So we had a quarter of folks who said they had both an educational certificate and a professional license or certification. A big question, I think, in terms of combining credentials is the extent to which certificates in particular lead to college degree. And that's not something we look at in this analysis, but we have seen from prior research that workers who have both a certificate and college degree, which, again, is very common, 2 out of 3 of those folks earn the certificate first and then the degree, whereas 1/3 earned the degree first, then the certificate. So there is evidence that that there is, that people are stacking these credentials in a certain respect. Second piece, the institutions that issue non-degree credentials are incredibly diverse. So, they include colleges, governments, professional associations, and individual businesses or companies. No single type of institution awards more than 20% of non-degree credentials. So that's kind of the landscape. The next thing that we looked at, and the question we're really most interested in, was how should we think about the quality and value of these credentials? And of course, there's no perfect way to do that. But what we've done in this analysis is look at 5 metrics that you see here that reflect the learner's perspective on their experience on the one hand, as well as some of the labor market outcomes associated with these non-degree options. So the 3 questions on the left that reflect the learner's perspective are: was it worth the cost? Did it help you achieve your goals? And did it make you an attractive candidate for jobs? And then we also, with respect to labor market outcomes, have 2 metrics underneath that, which are earnings and job satisfaction. So that's the kind of analytic framework that we're using for the purposes of this analysis. So we first looked at folks who, with non-degree credentials, and how they perceive the quality and the value of their education in comparison to those with associates and bachelor's degrees. And again, this is based on individuals' highest level of education. And what we see here is that essentially that non-degree credentials are rated pretty similar to associate degrees on these metrics, but substantially below the bachelor's degree, which is, it's the gold standard in post-secondary education. It's the most traveled pathway to good jobs in our nation, and crucially provides access to graduate degrees, which continue to have increasing value. One detailed note here that I'll call your attention to: the largest gap we actually see, which makes sense, is on that makes me an attractive job candidate metric, where bachelor's degrees are rated nearly 20 points higher in comparison to associate and non-degree credentials. That is. In terms of the labor market outcomes, we sort of similarly found that the median annual earnings for workers with non-degree credentials was substantially higher than high school graduates. Pretty similar to workers who had an associate degrees, but also substantially less than those who had a bachelor's degree or higher. And though the median earnings for people with non-degree credentials is similar to associate degrees, we also found, and this is in one of the detailed pieces that's in the report, that there's a bit more variation, meaning that folks with non-degree credentials are more likely to be in a low-wage job, a job that pays less than $30,000 annually. So even though it's the same average, there is some interesting detail in looking at the whole distribution. And again, that's in the full report. When we look at the job satisfaction rates for workers with non-degrees, they're actually relatively high. So we had 69% of workers with non-degree credentials who said they were very or extremely satisfied with their jobs, which is similar to the job satisfaction rate for workers with bachelor's degrees. But as I alluded to, because holding multiple credentials is so common, we also wanted to look at how the outcomes of folks who had both a college degree and a non-degree credentials compared to only those who had a college degree. And what we see is that the alumni who combined the degree and non-degree experiences, the ratings of their education are substantially higher than those who earn the degree in isolation, especially those with associate degrees. You can see a big difference there. And then the converse of that is true as well, meaning that if you have a non-degree credential and you go on to earn a college degree, they experience more value than only folks who have a non-degree credential. So that's kind of the high level findings on the quality and value of these and how they're sort of centered in the landscape. In the second part of the analysis, we tried to look underneath the non-degree programs and credentials and the specific characteristics of the program or the credential, which includes the length of the program, the field of study that it was earned, in which it was earned, and as well as the institution that issued the credential. So with respect to the length of programs, this is the single measure where we're looking at only people with educational certificates. So just to call that to your attention, we had 4 categories for program length: very short programs that only lasted a week to less than a month, those lasting 1 to 6 months, 6 months to a year, longer than a year. And essentially what we found in the end was that the length of the program really isn't a great predictor of its quality or value, at least, with respect to the metrics that we use in this analysis. So for example, you can see that very short programs were more likely to be considered worth the cost than those that lasted 1 to 6 months. As well, the programs that lasted 1 to 6 months were associated with higher earnings than those that lasted 6 months to a year. So it's really not necessarily about the length of the program, but rather which occupation or job that the credential provides you access to is the best way to think about that. We also examined outcomes by field, the field in which the individual earned their credential. And what we saw here was that healthcare non-degree credentials were rated the highest, but frankly, there was surprisingly less variation among fields than we typically see with the other outcome metrics. So it doesn't seem to be the field in the case that is driving the differences in quality and value, as far as we can tell. We also looked at how the outcomes varied across the different institutions, the providers or issuers of the non-degree credentials, and we found that community colleges and vocational technical colleges actually received the highest ratings of quality and value on the whole. And just to emphasize again, these are only for folks who reported non-degree as their highest level of education. So we didn't have enough sample on this metrics, for example, for 4-year colleges and universities, where earning degrees and certificates in combination is quite common. And they also, through their continuing education schools, issue a lot of post-baccalaureate certificates. Those aren't captured in this particular chart. So then last but not least, we looked at several demographic characteristics, including parents' education, gender, race, ethnicity, and age. So with respect to gender, there was a surprise, which was that there was really minimal variation in the ratings of quality and value of non-degree credentials when we looked at compared men and women. And the reason that's surprising is we know from previous research that gender-based occupational segregation is very high among workers who have non-degree credentials. So women tend to be concentrated in fields like healthcare support, education, cosmetology, while men tend to be concentrated in middle wage fields like construction and blue collar trades, transportation. And having done this work over many years, we tend to see that the alumni ratings of the quality and value, they tend to be correlated with labor market outcomes like earnings. So, if you do well in earnings, you tend to do better on the alumni ratings. But there are some exceptions, for example, education, where the alumni ratings are high, even though the earnings are relatively low. We didn't see much, so that was surprising, but we also didn't see much variation by age or parents' education. So for those cuts, for those of you who are interested, they're in the reports, and I encourage you to take a look at them there. The one demographic difference that we saw that was substantial and noteworthy was among by race ethnicity. And specifically what we saw here was that Black Americans who had non-degree credentials were much more positive about the quality and value compared to Latinos and white Americans, and conversely, white non-degree credential holders rated the quality and the value of them much lower, substantially lower. So only 53%, for example, said that their education made them an attractive job candidate. 46% said that it helped them achieve their goals. So with that, thank you. And I just, really hope that this work is helpful in, informing our understanding of the quality and value of these credentials. And obviously, we can't answer every question in this analysis. There's a lot more work to be done, a lot more questions to be answered. But I'm really excited to hear and learn from our panelists and from all of you. So, Paul.
Thanks, Andrew. Before we let you go, well, first of all, you're going to stick around, I know, for the Q&A. I just wanted to ask, can you give us some sense of where this new data fits in what we know about this space and what kind of the biggest research questions and gaps you see going forward?
I would say that we've had lots of we've had big surveys from the federal government, national surveys, where we can kind of report either on certificates, for example, or licenses and certification, and the labor market outcomes, which are a lot sort of easier kind of traditional measures of those. So those are kind of like big, similar to what we did here. And that's kind of where fits in. The main, what's sort of unique about it, I would say, is that these questions about alumni perspectives of the programs, which are not, they have been asked in certain instances, but they're not necessarily, I would say, commonly used in evaluating the quality and value of these programs. The other thing that we've seen is sort of like more institutional programmatic, where kinds of analyses where we're looking at individual institutions and kind of short-term outcomes, 1 year, 5 year, and so on, either within, like I said, individual institutions or systems like state systems. That's the kind of work I've seen. And then I don't want to go into too much detail because there's actually so much, and that we can learn. And I'd encourage you to go to the website of the group that Holly's leading, the Nondegree Credential Research Networks, because they have some great work, some great reports on where the field is and where, what more needs to be done. But I would say getting from these kind of high level to more a systematic understanding of the program level and having real-time data where we're actually able to track these, because the world is changing so fast. And a lot of times, for example, the last survey that the federal government did on this, and that was more comprehensive, was 2016, 5 years ago, the Adult Training and Education Survey. So we need to find ways to measure and integrate non-degree credentials and experiences into our data systems, which are still very much rely on traditional measures of educational attainment. So that's what I'd say.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, so I'm going to turn it to our expert panelists, and let's start with a bit of a gut check on the pace of change. As Andrew mentioned, things are moving fast in this space. I'm going to start with Holly, just to get a sense of what you're watching most closely in the non-degree space, what you see as potentially experiencing the most growth. I mean, what's keeping your attention?
Oh, thanks so much, and I'm so glad to join everybody. And I do want to shout out, I don't lead the non-degree credential research network at George Washington University alone. Kyle Albert and Steve Crawford are my co-conspirators, and there are more than 100 researchers around the country, and there are actually some international that participate. And they're both researchers who spend a lot of their time thinking about these issues, but also the users of data, because we feel like it's really important to align the stakeholders who have to actually use data in conversations with researchers. And we found that that's a very effective way to try to network around this growing area of concern. But to answer your question directly, Paul, what I'm really watching the growth in these short-term credentials and what that means. Credential Engine every year puts out a report identifying what are the numbers of discrete credentials in the US, and every year it's going up. And in part because of short-term credentialing. And so the last report that came out just some months ago is up at, I don't know, close to 1 million, like 960,000. So who knows what it'll be next year, but I predict that it will be a higher number, and that a lot of that will be due to non-degree short-term credentials. I also think that I've been watching more and more the packaging of the combos of credentials, because I think that's so interesting. If you think about the lifetime of acquiring your knowledge and skills, it's not likely you're going to just have one of these things. What you're probably going to do, and the power of this may be in the combinations. And when do you require them? All early on, or are they sequenced? And Andrew started to get at some of the sequencing. So those are some of the things that I'm looking at. And also the timeline. I feel like the data is telling us that students are starting earlier in high school. Some of them are acquiring industry awarded certifications and certificates along with their diplomas, and then it's likely going to go later. It's going to go later than 65 because a lot of people are going to hang in the workforce, which I hope they do personally, but many of them will be acquiring short-term credentials as they make job changes, as our economy changes. So we're likely, the data is going to look different, I predict, over the next several years. And I have more, but I'm going to stop there and wait for more questions.
We'll be back to you, Holly. Let's turn to Stella. Can you give us a sense of what you're watching most closely, areas that you think are most promising or worrisome?
Well, Paul, thank you very much. And it is a pleasure to be here and great to be a part of this panel. Speaking on behalf of community colleges looking to community college future. And what we see from a number of the organizations looking at community college research groups, CCRC, we look to Achieving the Dream, we look to AACC, because community colleges stand ready to pivot. They stand ready to pivot because we look at industry needs on the ground. We look at them in our states, we look at them in the region. And so the idea that we serve in a very quick way, looking to move students into the workforce in a semester. And in doing so, that is coming up with programs, coming up with resources, staying close to the industry leaders. And to Holly's point, students are moving into the industries and career pathways much earlier. Dual enrollment, concurrent enrollment is happening in much earlier stages. And dual enrollment is an amazing option. Students can move into college credit. Students can move into also their high school credit. And the majority of those courses are free. They're free to the student. Concurrent enrollment, that's a different strategy. And having that experience, looking into those apprenticeships, offers students that non-degree experience, moving then into the workforce, getting them into early career paths so they have some ideas of what they may choose to be, because we also know from the research, they're going to change careers a number of different times, much more so than we did in our generation. And that's going to be an opportune experience. And again, we have to be ready to serve those needs. So we need to rely on that data. We need to look forward to the data coming forward that will be a resource for us all.
Thanks, Stella. Just a quick program note here. As you all have probably seen, Nicole Torpey-Sabo and Dave Clayton are answering questions as we speak in the Q&A. You all are doing a great job of engaging there, so keep them coming. So I want to take a quick step back. To me, among the findings that jumped out, and there are a lot of them, it was the credential combo. If folks who combine a degree with one of these non-degree credentials, seeing big payoffs. That kind of goes against how we talk about everything in America these days. It's right now, it's kind of degrees versus skills-based hiring. But looks like there may be room for a little bit of both, hopefully without credentialism that causes folks problems. So big topic here, but Holly, can you riff on that a little bit? What are your thoughts about the potential to pair credentials up with degrees?
So I do think that combos are the name of the game. And some of you know that I use an example of if you go through that drive-through to get the burger or whatever you're going to get, and they ask you in the garbled voices they come to you, do you want the combo or do you just want the whatever? And I always just want the burger. I don't want the combo. But they always say, but the combo is a better deal. And then I always say, no, I just want, but the fact is, it may be that the combo is the better deal here. And I feel like we need to be thinking carefully about that. And that's why the data that Andrew's been able to pull together and others who are working on this is so important for us to understand that, because In the case of industry certifications, there's the beginning of a movement, both at community colleges and in universities, to embed industry certifications into traditional degree programs. That could be very, very powerful in many industry sectors. We also think that there are some innovative projects that are underway, particularly led by the Design Lab, to embed or to couple 21st century skills, which are really badges, mostly on soft skills, not entirely, with traditional degrees, with associate degrees or bachelor's degrees. We think that could be really powerful, and employers are telling them in the various locations where they're doing research that that's the kind of person that they want. And so the faculty are trying to accommodate a badge plus a traditional degree. Now, my guess is we'll end up with lots of combos in our drive-through, and that we need to accept that, and that we need to figure out in which career pathways does it make most sense. Do you need to get your combos early, or can you add them later? In the case of nursing, sometimes people get their nursing degree and then they add specialty certificates later on if they're going to be an ICU nurse or a burn or a transplant nurse, and they get them from, say, from a hospital. They don't, or a third party, they don't get them from the university that they went to. So I predict that we're going to see more of these combos, and that we're going to need good data to understand how the world is really working, so that we can tell students, so that they can figure this out, and they won't be surprised when they're told, oh, well, you're getting the degree, but by the way, you have to go over here to this other place to get this other, and I hate to say the word non-degree, that doesn't sound great to a parent. You're getting a non something. In Europe and elsewhere, they call them micro-credentials. So we have a different word, but we're all talking about micro-credentials. So I'll stop there again, but I do think combos are kind of the way of the future.
Stella, anything you want to add there on the way we discuss kind of degrees versus non-degree?
Well, and I think there are 2 points, and Holly's right on target. It says something to the business, to the industry. An associate degree even says to an industry provider, this person is a completer. This person is finished. This person is dedicated to they've made a commitment to finalize, to complete. And then they have a capstone. They have a specialization in a field. Or, moving in the reverse format. I have a dear colleague who leads one of the larger community college districts, who will comment about community colleges are not or working with industry leaders, we're not in the customer relations scenario. We're there to provide client services. We're not in a transactional piece or a transactional scenario. We want clients in the long term. We want students who come to community colleges. We work with them through learning experiences, whether it's a non-degree certification, non-degree diploma, non-degree credential, and then they come back to us because we're their learning provider in the community, in that region, and they come back for a diploma or a degree. We want that to happen, and businesses and industries look to us for that. And it becomes not just a one-time, one-off. That's really important for us. And that's what builds that lifelong learner. That's what builds. And then they also have the confidence. Many of our students who come into the non-degree or the certifications, they've been out of college or out of high schools for 10 years, or some have never been in a higher education experience. So this is our opportunity to provide that successful model for them. So I'll stop at that point.
I'm going to stick with you for a minute, Stella. I want to talk equity. Obviously, the finding of Black Americans having relatively more positive views of these credentials jumped out at me, and I think everybody. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on these credentials across kind of race and gender?
I was also, that was a surprising factor. I think we can unpack that. I would like to look at disaggregating the data in more of a longitudinal piece. I think it's important to look at, even as we look at the non-degree credentials, when we look at certificates, it is looking at how also, I'll speak to only community colleges, how those basic skills are integrated into the curriculum. We want to look at math skills. We want to look at communication skills. how community colleges look at, we have to integrate those skills for automotive technology. We have to look at how we integrate those skills into, I'm going to speak to one I know well, wastewater management, because those measurement skills, those types of science skills are critical. We don't want students making mistakes in those areas. And then they have to sit for state certifications and other requirements that we want them to be successful in. And again, many of these students, our learners, have been out of higher education for 10 years now, or have never been in college courses. And so to that end, it's very important to us that they start that pathway on a successful note. And underrepresented groups, first generation, women, we want to see women coming in to those potentially non-traditional or coming into those certificate programs with success.
Particularly the ones that lead to the better paying jobs, which we know hasn't been the case across gender lines historically. Holly, any thoughts to add there? I know there's a lot.
You know, the biggest concern, as many of us talk about micro-credentialing or the growth in, the biggest concern I hear is, well, we don't want to track students. We don't want people of color to be going to the short-term credentials. They won't earn as much long-term. And so we can't change the system because of that. And that's why we need data like this in order to understand better, particularly in the different career areas, to inform us better about what are some of the best ways. Everyone doesn't go through their educational pathways in the same way. So I think about this as a fairness issue. Do we have a fair post-secondary system in the United States? I think the answer is no. It never was fair to everybody. It still isn't fair to everybody. And we have an opportunity, partly because of COVID, that we have an opportunity to redesign our systems as quickly as we can as we're trying to recover. And this is the time to build better pathways and focus on fairness. And I think those are the issues around short-term credentials raises that on the flagpole. What are we going to do? What is our financing model going to be? Are we going to support people to gain short-term credentials? And I see a lot of items in the chat around credit and non-credit. It's a very big issue. I'm not going to speak to it unless unless we go there. But I feel like we're going there longer term, is we have to figure out what is learning and why is some learning credited and some is non-credited. So I feel like this is part of us opening doors to a fair system.
Well, let's go there. Let's talk non-credit for a minute. Obviously, a big part of this. Andrew, can you lay out, what you see as the key issues in the kind of interplay between non-credit and credit in this space, and what we know and what we don't know?
Well, there's a trade-off with respect to non-credit credit and non-credit that I've kind of seen in the field over the years, which is, if you make a non-degree program credit bearing, then it more easily stacks into that further credential, right? It's just easier to get credit towards a degree later, which is very important. As you look into individual community colleges and regions, they like the flexibility of non-credit, and they don't have to go through the process of making a program credit-bearing program, and so it helps them be more responsive to local employers. And so, to me, I think this issue that continues to come again and again is, how do we give learners credit for prior learning? And there are many different approaches to that. Prior learning assessments is one. I mean, they're to doing that, but it's a priority for students, as Holly talks about, a system that's fair. I think that's something that we need to find solutions to. And I don't know if it's through the for credit non-credit means. It may be through something else. Open to thinking more about that. I would say, just for the purposes of our survey research, the challenge that we run into in doing something like this, a sample survey, is that students do not understand the difference between, or former learners, between for credit and non-credit. To them, it's just a program. They have a hard enough time differentiating between a certificate, this or that credential or degree, right? So it's not something that's we can investigate through this kind of means analytically. You might be able to do it through administrative data that comes from the colleges themselves, or some other means to kind of look at those issues. But that's kind of how I see the issue.
Thanks, Andrew. You know, I saw in the chat, a couple states are looking at making credit pathways more universal for short-term non-degree credentials, including Ohio, hoping to report on that soon. Obviously, California, Stella, has done a lot in terms of transfer and credit between the 2-year and 4-year space. Not there yet necessarily, but your thoughts on what to watch, what's most important in terms of students getting credit for these credentials?
Well, I mean, let's go back to what credit and non-credit means, especially to first generation minority groups. First of all, credit offers financial aid. And financial aid means a great deal to underrepresented groups. And as I always say, community colleges, when we look at the differences between universities and community colleges, and to Holly's point about a drive-through and the combo meal, what I always say about community colleges is, community colleges set a table, and community colleges then find a chair for everyone at that table. That open door means something. And so, whereas universities are selective, they have a very different approach to who is going to enroll at that institution. And by that, you know, by virtue of that, we have a different mission. But to Andrew's point, administratively, we also have a responsibility to that. And that comes through counseling, that comes through advising. And we also do that. We work with high schools at a different level. Our job is to initiate and work with high school counselors, because when you have a student whose parents have never gone to college, whose parents potentially speak a different, or English is not their first language, and you put an online FAFSA form in front of them, what does that mean? And so our job, our goal is to help break down a lot of those barriers. And I really appreciate that we're talking about equity in some format, in some way. This is part of how we stack credentials, how we have career and economic mobility. If we create and maintain these cycles, and, you know, moving forward to the pandemic, the recession taught us one thing about certificates. The pandemic is teaching us something else, because there's a whole different set of workforce skills coming out of that. We're not looking at the same jobs any longer. And so to that end, community colleges, universities, we do have different roles. And I'll set it at that.
You know, who would have thought that the combo meal would be the soundbite of this panel? I love it. So I'm going to come back to you, Holly. You know, you can talk non-credit if you'd like, but I feel like maybe we should turn to, you mentioned looking internationally. And, you know, what do we know from what other countries are doing with micro-credentials that might apply to the current big questions we face here?
So the first thing we know is most of the other nations, many of the nations are ahead of us, ahead of the United States, and we don't seem to know that here. And part of it is an issue that Andrew mentioned it earlier, is that we call the same thing by different names. So if they mostly use the term micro-credential and we're still talking about non-degrees, we don't even know if we're doing the same thing. But the fact is, there's a lot of activity going on in many other nations. And I prepared a little quote. I was hoping that I could put this one into my remarks. So I just want to read this quote quickly and see if you can tell which nation said this. The global pandemic has accelerated the digital transformation of post-secondary learning amid historic shifts in our labor market. Micro-credentials, short duration, targeted learning for skills and competency development are fast becoming a key route to ensuring that those displaced by the pandemic and those wishing to upskill or reskill can quickly learn and fill new jobs. Well, this is actually from Canada, but the reality is you could fill almost any nation's name in there and it would be accurate. And so I think that is actually really telling, but that many in the United States think that this is somewhat new for us, but it's not new for many other nations. And what's very interesting, and I noticed when people were saying hello at the beginning, that there are several folks from Canada who signed on, and thrilled that you're here. But what's really interesting is that the Canadian government is putting a fair amount of money and time and research into this area of micro-credentialing, so like a $32 million investment to provide practical solutions for helping folks get back to work and gain the kind of skills they need in the new economy. And I would indicate that my institution that is helping to lead the Non-Degree Credential Research Network actually brought in people from OECD in April to let us know what's going on in the 38 nations anyway that OECD tends to work with. And we heard a lot of really interesting things. First is that there was a surge of interest and urgency among many other nations around micro-credentialing. And in fact, one of the experts from OECD said that there's a worldwide sprint taking place in countries around the world as educators deal with these rapid innovations. So, I mean, that's pretty interesting. And they kind of match what Andrew has in his pie chart in the slides, that there's many different providers. I think he has 7 different kind of providers. Other nations have that too. It's not just higher ed institutions providing these kinds of credentials. It's employers, and it's specialty groups and 7 different kind of groups. So what does it say when you have that much carrying on in a marketplace? It says to me, chaos. No one's going to understand it. How are we going to work with it? How is it going to change as all these changes are underway? So there are many nations I think that are way ahead: New Zealand, Australia, the Netherlands, the Flemish community of Belgium, Scotland, and a bunch of others, to be honest. And I think that one of the things that would benefit us all is that we could learn what our colleagues outside the US are doing, and they could learn from us, and that we could do some kind of networks among us all, particularly researchers, to share intel. And that's I think a newly developing understanding that a lot of us have, is that we should not be so parochial and as important as these issues are.
These and other issues. So I want to open this up to all 3 of you. A bunch of the questions have related to the role of employers here, whether it's driving demand for these credentials, having jobs that pair up with these credentials, whether their HR departments will catch up to their C-suites in interest in these credentials, and they're issuing them themselves. You've got employer credentials. So what are you watching most closely from the employer space? What's most important for them to make sure that students are going to be holding something of value? And I'm going to start with Andrew on this one, if you'd like.
Sure. My experience looking at this issue of credentialing and which credentials matter and which credentials employers care about is that employers, through their applicant tracking system, use bachelor's and graduate degrees in order to filter job candidates. So in order to even get your resume looked at, you have to have those kinds of degrees. As when we look below that space, even if we're looking at non-degree credentials, some non-degree credentials, associate degrees, and so on and so forth, that depends. That depends on the industry, and the industries, to the extent they're looking at these sub-BA credentials, sometimes they're required for licensure. In the case, like sometimes associate degrees will be required for licensure. Other times it'll be an industry-based certification that's prevalent in that industry. So it really depends. I think that the value of the certificates issued by community colleges and universities, the value is really the skills, in my opinion, rather than the signaling power of the credential itself. I think it's less, just because any individual certificate is far less prevalent than, say, bachelor's degrees, that it doesn't make sense for employers to filter for them. And you go and talk to community colleges, what they say is what the local employer really cares about is whether the workers can do the job. So non-credit, this or that certificate, so on and so forth, matters less to them than just having confidence that who they hire are going to have those minimum skills requirements. So that's my perspective. There's one question that I saw in the Q&A about, have we seen any kind of changes to the extent to which employers are expressing a preference for these kinds of credentials? course, it varies by industry, but I haven't necessarily seen that. But perhaps Holly, says I know has, I know we've got our colleague Sean Gallagher would probably be the person to ask about that kind of question. But I'm not aware of any research that shows like an uptick in employers expressing a preference for these credentials.
It's obviously Sean Gallagher at Northeastern. And, you know, sitting here in Washington, it feels like a lot of pressure now on employers to look beyond the college degree. Hard to tell how deep that goes, but across equity lines, it feels like a argument to watch. I'm going to turn to Stella. Anything you want to add on this very broad question?
Well, Andrew, good point. And I actually saw it in the chat coming up because beyond corporate timing, industry will ask for certain credentials, certain requirements, and those come forward in 6 months. And so again, community colleges move forward, they pivot. Some require equipment or resources. Hopefully we can partner, hopefully we can find ways to bring those forward in that 6 months. There are levels of bureaucracy that have to occur. And then if there's a match, if we can do that, then will corporations accept the certified, the qualified graduates? And you know, there's the application, there's the performance standards. There are those measures as well. Timing is critical and industry changes so quickly. I recently had a conversation with a community college chancellor in the Northeast who said he's shutting down a very, very large auto mechanics program. And I thought, wait, why are you doing that? And he said, because his whole industry in the region is going to electric car performance and service maintenance. And they're saturated in regular mechanical training programs in areas by the for-profits. I mean, to me, that was shocking. And yet in the lower Southwest, they've just built this high-tech center for excellence. Regionally, it's a big challenge in many, many areas. How do community colleges, how does the country keep up with those trends?
Holly, you want to jump on that one?
Sure. I a few points. I think that some of the large employers are starting to obviously offer their own credentials. And there's a reason why they are, because they may be in specialty areas or they don't think higher ed can or will offer them. And it's become a product at some of those companies, not only for their own employees, but for the public. And they're particularly in the IT area. So I don't think we can overgeneralize about what happens in healthcare versus IT versus something else. Another important development is that some of the employers, they don't know what learning stands behind the credential, which I don't think they do in many cases, and so, or they don't trust it anyway, because there's so many different providers. So they're doing their own assessments, and a lot of learners, students coming to their jobs, don't realize that they're going to have a whole nother assessment that the employer is going to lay on top of it to determine what learning sits behind them. So that's partly our own fault, is that we haven't identified the learning outcomes very well. I think there's a move to do that, to bring transparency to all of our credentials, and that would include the short-term credentials, so that employers actually know what they're getting when someone shows up with this credential or this combo of credentials. And Credential Engine is playing a role in trying to solve that. If we can develop a database where employers can actually go and understand what you took. And then there's those issues of quality. There is a concern about, is there enough quality in those credentials? And one last thing, and I'll say, there's a little quote that a colleague of mine uses, and he says, "It's been said that half of these credentials we know aren't any good. We just don't know which half." Now, if you're an employer and someone's showing up and you're thinking, I don't know, half of them are good, but we don't know which half, that is not a good thing. So then what would you do in order to determine if the person had the skills? You'd probably assess yourself. You'd go toward work and learn, toward apprenticeships where you could check people out and help with and mentor them along the way. And I actually think that is the way that we're starting to go because of these many questions.
And Paul, if I could just add a point to Holly's comment. One of the big challenges we see with industries setting up their own credential is, if it is industry specific to that corporation, how does that transfer for an individual who then moves on to another corporation? So the value, the viability, the career or economic upward mobility, what does that say? And that would be my point there.
So you've raised a bunch of points here about why it's hard to assess quality of these credentials. Not to say that degrees are easy to assess either, but I know right now there are a bunch of folks who are working on state policy, not to mention the federal government, thinking about how to subsidize non-degree programs and which ones to focus on. An enormously difficult question here on our last 6 minutes, but can you just give some principles of program design that you think and the guardrails that policymakers should focus on to make sure that non-degree credentials pay off? Holly, I'll give you that softball to start.
One of them is to ensure that in the planning of the programs, particularly with the traditional colleges and universities, that employers are involved in the design of, and that they stay with students, that they open work and learn opportunities, particularly to get at the issues that Stella already raised. Like, what if the whole employment situation is changing and they're not going to do the old style, let's say, manufacturing of cars, and they're moving to electric something else? Like, the employers need to be involved, and we need good data on where are the jobs going to be, not data from 3 years ago, because that is not going to help us because the workforce is changing so much. We need to have multiple methods of trying to predict where the jobs will be and putting our money in our policy on some of those. So I feel like there's a lot of things that are beginning to go into play and hooking these things together. And I would just add to something that Stella said, some of the employers behind the scenes are getting together to talk about whether or not what you learn in a credential taken at one company might be generalizable and you would develop certain skills to another one. They recognize they're starting to act like a mini higher ed system. And with that comes some responsibility, and you could say even maybe accountability. And so there's some interesting work behind the scenes on what that could look like going forward.
Thanks, Holly. I'm going to let Andrew add anything you want to add there on data or competency mapping?
I'll say no. I think it's a huge challenge because, I think we like to think of these things kind of from a a high level top down kind of way. It varies so much across regions and industries what's going to work best, and a lot of times we have these legacy systems that weren't necessarily well designed that are leading to the current dynamic, and it's just a tough nut to crack. I'll say that much. But it's a conversation that we have to have because the world is changing and our systems aren't kind of keeping up for how to think about what the topics that we've talked about today, and we really need to do it if we're going to create a system that's fair and serves learners equitably, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Stella, anything you want to add there?
Just some key points that have been raised, and that is surrounding policy is rather than having legislators, rather than having policy tell educators, tell us what to do. It's discussions like this where we come together and look to the data, look to the research coming forward so that we as educators, we as learners can put this forward and create our own paths. I think we know, those of us who are closest to the students, to the learners, to the data, can start making sense of what we want to see happen. The legislation is not providing that roadmap. They're not keeping us close to the industry leaders. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, I feel like this more than most topics, we could have gone on for another hour or two. I have to say, I participate in a lot of virtual events. I have never seen an audience as engaged as this one. I want to thank you all for joining us. I hope you got your questions answered. And the good news is the transcript of this, the video and the slides will all be emailed your way as soon as we hang up here. Amazingly, I'm going to give you an extra minute or so of your day and we're going to wrap here. But I want to thank Holly, Stella, Andrew, and everyone for making this a great event.
Thank you all.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.